One of the things we do about violence in this country is to think about what works in the United States. And the problem is, in the United States, the major problem with violence is guns. And fortunately, this country's already figured that out, at least for the time being, compared to the US, Latin America, and many other places. But it's been very helpful to think about, for example, what else could you do besides stop and search for dealing with weapons, because a lot of the stop and search research in the United States is about taking guns off the street and pushing down murders. Well, we also have weapons. They're not guns. But what is at stake is carrying weapons and being angry and killing people because you got a weapon. And so what you're about to hear is a very important set of findings that concern ways to reduce gun violence that have nothing to do with searching people and everything to do with making a beautiful garden. And so, does that sound implausible? Okay, get your skeptical ears ready and let me introduce to you a member of the oversight panel for the New York City Police Department, which is kind of like permanent special measures from the HMIC. He's also done this in several other cities because he's generally interested in all things policing. He's also my former colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, where he has been chair of the Department of Criminology and director of the Fels Institute of Government, which also addressed a wide range of issues, primarily in urban governance. He lives in Philadelphia, which is one of the most violent cities in the United States, but it's not his fault. In fact, what he's done through his research has helped to reduce the violence.
It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to you about some of my work, thinking about how we can change places to make them safer and healthier. This is part of the theme of a book that I wrote that's shamelessly plugged here, so if anyone's interested, I think it's about 20 pounds. I'm going to highlight, though, kind of two areas where we have experimental research that I think is pretty convincing about how you can reduce gun violence by focusing on the situational aspects of places, which to those of you who have studied criminology here, you've heard the words like situational crime prevention, crime prevention through environmental design. So I'm going to be focusing my discussion around kind of those theoretical concepts. And the basic idea here is that kind of the decisions about our successes are deeply rooted in the context of the places where we live, we work, we play. And so we should be thinking a lot more about how to design safer and healthier places. And in some ways, this is just returning to 19th century ideas. Places like London, in terms of how do you design a city to make it safer and healthier. But focusing on crime prevention rather than maybe the quality of water or air. But the idea is ultimately that we should be marrying some of the ideas from urban planning with criminology and preferably evidence-based policing and public health, thinking about the concentration of community harms into science of place-based experiments that can inform our actual policy decisions. So I'm going to talk about, kind of frame this around basic idea of broken windows theory, which has been much maligned but much misunderstood. If you actually read the article, nowhere does do Wilson and Kelling say there needs to be zero tolerance policing. The basic idea is to think about how blighted built environments can spread disorder, right? So if you think about blighted vacant spaces, in Philadelphia this is a big problem, not so much in the UK, but you have other problems about, with regard to physical disorder. What happens? Visually becomes unpleasant, incivilities go up. Residents feel disconnected from places. Criminal offenders can feel emboldened, especially when the streets become more empty. There's fewer eyes and ears. People's health gets worse, stress, hypertension, crime goes up. Residents, if they can, leave, right? And businesses disinvest from places. And then the cycle continues. So how do we break this cycle? Well, I'm going to focus on thinking about strategically about the built environment. So why does this matter? Well, in the United States, and around the world, but in the United States, I'm going to focus, as Professor Sherman mentioned, on gun violence. Gun violence and serious crime is highly concentrated by place. 3 to 6% of street segments in most cities in the United States account for about 50% of reported gun violence and serious crime. The concentration of gun violence is also relatively stable over time, suggesting there must be endemic features of places that matter. And to quote Professor Sherman in his 1989 article, changing places is actually easier than changing people, right? You think about the routine activities of places and how those might be able to be regulated. So what are some of the salient features? I'll just give you a graph, for example, of Philadelphia. So in Philadelphia, this is a plot 2015 to 2020, end of 2021, of where all the gun violence is located in terms of street segments. And what you see is that at 2.6% of street segments, you have 50% of the shootings. Now you may ask, how many shootings are there in Philadelphia? Sadly, right now we're averaging about 2,400 a year. So we had over 500 homicides last year, and we're on pace to do the same this year. So this isn't just concentrated, it's also extremely high rates of shootings in these places. You get to 11% of street segments, you have 100% of all the shootings in the city. So shootings are highly concentrated by place. What I want to emphasize in this research is, how do you think about what you're going to do? So what I'm arguing is there's three kind of cardinal rules that you have to stick by. One is thinking about what are the structural aspects of places that you can change. So what are the sidewalks? How are the planting? So what's the cleanup? So what is the actual physical built environment like? Think about operations that can be scaled to populations. The police and other city agencies aren't going to be able to redesign, a complete neighborhood. But what are the strategic aspects that you can do? Choose programs that can be sustained, ideally over time, and then test these out, right, and replicate their success. So I'm going to give you two examples of this. And usually with the audience, I have to explain randomized trial. I realize you've already been converted into the evidence-based policing framework. So usually I use a graph like this and I explain, the randomized trial principle. So you think about aspirin, randomly assigned to patients, versus maybe grass and AstroTurf. The irony is actually here in Cambridge, the first randomized trials are actually in looking at grass treatment. And Fisher's work coming up with analysis of variance actually came out of that research. And so medicine actually takes its history and randomized trials from agricultural research. Anyway, just a sidebar to say this is where it all began. So thinking about specifically, though, in situ. So where can you do experiments that are right embedded in the places where the action's happening? So going from the lab to the actual field. And in nowhere in the United States, there's kind of two problems that I'm going to focus on. One is vacant housing. And so in the United States, we have a big problem, legacy cities, of abandoned housing. So this is a picture from Detroit, Michigan, but it's true in Philadelphia. Any of the former industrial cities in the United States have massive problems with vacant and abandoned housing. So the question often comes up, do we rebuild or do you just let people escape? I think there are reasons to argue that we can't just ask people or expect everyone to move. And there are reasons, many reasons, to try to hold on to that vacant housing and keep it in reasonable shape, well, for the people that both live there nearby, and also so eventually it can be restored, rehabilitated, and people can move back. So in Philadelphia, we've had lots of different efforts to try to combat abandoned housing. 2010, the city recognized this. There was an inventory where finally somebody kind of counted up how many abandoned houses were, and they counted some 3,000 vacant houses that had been abandoned, about 40,000 vacant properties in general. So these are kind of vacant lots or torn down houses. And the city passed an ordinance that basically said that if a house is abandoned, the owner of the house has to install working windows and doors. So you can't just board things up. there's a variety of reasons I could get into in Q&A why boarding things up alone is probably bad. But it's not just an eyesore. There's kind of a recognition that boarding places up is going to be criminogenic. And so the city passed this ordinance, and you can see an example of where people are compliant after they become compliant with the ordinance. So you see an example here of kind of the boarded up house with the violation notice on it, and then the after picture of what happens when they're in compliance. So we did initially just a quasi-experimental study to look at what happens when houses move from being compliant to non-compliant, kind of in the same areas. Now, it's a quasi-experiment. We have before-after, we have comparison groups, but we didn't randomly assign it. So I'll just give you a quick highlight of the main findings. So we had, a comparison of houses before and after that were compliant compared to those who were non-compliant with the ordinance. And then we looked at changes in crime. And what we found is 20% reduction in assaults, 39% reduction in gun assaults, and 16% fewer nuisance crimes. So gun assaults in the United States, in Philadelphia, means that someone's been, had a weapon pointed at them or has been shot. So either threat or actual shooting. When you have a study like this, it provides kind of compelling evidence, but it's not causal. So we decided to actually do a randomized trial in partnership with city agencies, the Housing Authority, and a local nonprofit. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to highlight a graph of the main effects after kind of walking you through quickly how the trial worked. Now, the reason I'm not going to go into details on the real specific point estimates is because this is embargoed right now in a medical journal, and I don't want them to say they won't publish the paper. So this is a collaboration between myself, Gina South, who's an MD physician, Charles Brandis, who's an epidemiologist, Greg Ridgway, who's a statistician. So this was a collaborative effort. And we had to work Charlie and I primarily, and Gina, work with agencies get a whole legal arrangement set up to do this trial. But basically, here's how the trial worked. We had over 3,600 abandoned houses. We had to look for those who were eligible. In other words, they were in violation of the city ordinance. And then we had to build, yesterday, the idea of block randomization came up. This is the same principle. It's called cluster randomization, but essentially the same idea is we formed clusters of abandoned houses. We assured that each one of these clusters, spatial clusters, were similar on poverty, serious crime, some demographics, and then we randomized across clusters to 3 treatments. So we have a control condition, we have a condition where they get full abandoned housing remediation, working windows and doors, and then we have a trash cleanup condition, which is like, well, what happens if somebody just picks up the trash and the debris, or what people in the UK, I guess, call fly tipping, right? So that kind of aspect around these properties. So here's an example. House, you can see before, and then it receives the treatment, noticeable difference, and also, the trash is picked up. Then the trash cleanup condition here, right? Somebody's dumped a couch and a bunch of other crap there. And then the control condition, which nothing happens. And we looked at what happens to serious crime, and I'm going to highlight the evidence on shootings. That was our primary outcome, gun violence related outcomes before and after across these 3 groups. And we found a statistically significant improvement in weapons violations on the order of about 8%. Gun assaults went down by about 12%, and shootings down by about 8%. All these are statistically significant. You see that they're below 0. That's a confidence interval. And even if I adjust for potential false discovery, these are like, on the order of 4 to 6 standard deviation differences. So these aren't, statistical flukes at all. We see a little bit of evidence on trash cleanup for gun assaults, but not for the other outcomes. So I think the evidence is not compelling for trash cleanup, at least in this trial. So this, I think, is some pretty compelling evidence that something as simple as just putting working windows and doors on houses can help reduce gun violence, and we don't find evidence that being displaced nearby as well. We do analysis looking at spatial displacement, and importantly, we picked areas with high rates of gun violence. So we're seeing the effect in the places that matters, where this matters the most. My colleague, Gina South, now is launching a much bigger trial of not just abandoned housing, but other aspects of cleaning up places that's just getting started now in the city. So Larry mentioned nature and gardens. So now I want to show you evidence we have from what happens if you take not an abandoned house, but a vacant and abandoned lot. So this actually, I'll skip over this pilot, but basically the idea started in the early 1990s. There's lots of abandoned vacant spaces in the city. People are upset about it. Local horticultural society agreed to kind of partner and do this kind of relatively low cost cleaning and greening intervention. And so here's the intervention. The basic idea is you take an abandoned lot that's overgrown, full of trash, debris, and you clean it up. And you put, you clean it up, plant some grass, and put this kind of picket fence out. Keith Green now runs this program. It's called Land Care. So this is an example of a lot that Keith oversaw being cleaned up, and they're quite beautiful. And they're right in the middle of the poorest neighborhood. So you essentially have these kind of pocket parks, and every 2 weeks during the planting season, so that's March through November in Philadelphia, landscape crews come through and pick up the debris and trash and mow and blow. So we had some earlier evidence from a quasi-experimental study suggesting that there was also effects on reducing serious crime, and we decided to do a randomized trial of this to kind of prove that our earlier study held up. So the basic idea is to randomize some of these vacant lots to receive the cleaning and greening, and the others to kind of stay in this permanent state of disrepair, at least during the trial. And then I should say after the trial was ended, there was money to actually green these lots later on. We found substantial reductions in nuisance crimes, gun assaults, and a combination of kind of all part one or a felony-related, I don't know what the right term is in the UK, but serious crimes that somebody could go to prison for. We found significant reductions on that, just looking at between lots that were greened, randomized versus those that weren't. We found the effects were slightly larger for areas below the Philadelphia poverty line, suggesting you might get even a bigger effect. Although this is a subgroup analysis, so it's not. We can't be assured that the effect's larger in high poverty areas because we didn't randomize within high poverty areas. And then we also looked at shootings. And the evidence for shootings was similarly compelling. One of the things I forgot to mention is one of the arms that we had a full treatment, and then we had kind of a partial treatment where they didn't put in the picket fence. And in general, we found there's no difference. As long as you have someone kind of picking up the lot, putting grass down, and then maintaining it. You don't really necessarily need the fence. So we found significant reductions in shootings on the order of about 7% if you took kind of the average of the two. We look at the actual costs of this intervention, vacant lot greening. I haven't done this with the vacant housing trial. That's the next paper. But for about $1 investment, that would be, I guess, about 1 point, depends on the exchange. Actually,
about 82 pence.
Yeah, about 82 pence. It's going better for us. I'm happy to be in the UK right now. You don't have the inflation problems that we're having. So, believe it or not, it's way worse in the US. So for about $1 or 80 pence, you get about $333 return on investment if you consider kind of the total social costs of crime. If you look at just direct kind of costs in terms of an arrest, a prosecution, about a $26 return is what we calculate. In terms of actual, people often ask, well, what does it cost to prevent a shooting? My calculations suggest for about a $15,000 investment in vacant lot greening, you can prevent one shooting. Obviously a shooting is way more costly than $15,000. It would cost about $35 to $45 million to scale this for the entire city of Philadelphia. We've had 2 mayoral proposals to scale it, but they haven't done it yet. So I keep hoping that the city will say, yeah, that's in our plan. But $45 million is a cheap one-time investment for Philadelphia compared, when you're spending on the order of $700 million for the police, more than that for the school system. It's one time, and then maybe about 5, probably in present day dollars, realistically, probably about $8 million to maintain a year for the entire city. So something I think that could be scaled. Now, I talked a lot about Philadelphia, and I'll just say that it's not, the evidence isn't alone on these kinds of place-based greening interventions to Philadelphia. We see evidence, a recent meta-analysis came out, but evidence from similar types of quasi-experiments, not randomized trials, but pretty good quasi-experiments in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Youngstown, Ohio, Chicago, Illinois, as well as Flint, Michigan. So all these kind of deindustrialized cities with similar problems, some aspect of cleaning and greening, vacant parcels, vacant lots seems to contribute to crime reductions. So where next? I think where next is this should just be part and parcel of place-based efforts to reduce crime. Where the police, I think, are involved is figuring out what are the right situational dynamics. Police know on the streets, they know the areas, but not, you know where the trash is, you know where the areas that have been overgrown, and the police can be embedded in working with planning agencies to actually seek these interventions out. And structural changes to places that are long-lasting and are scalable, I think, are important because they can also help communities rebuild. They can make a place more visually pleasant. You think about the amount of money the University of Cambridge spends making these colleges look beautiful. Are they just doing that? I mean, there's something in our DNA that when you're walking around a place and you see it's well cared for, it connects to you. And I think we should be thinking more strategically about that. I have one little video. It explains this probably better than I could. Basically, they're making the argument that the environment constantly is shaping our decisions.
Subtly influence how we make decisions. And that fact can be used for more than just making money. In fact, it can also be used to make our neighborhoods safer. Here's how it works. If you asked people to describe what a dangerous neighborhood looks like, chances are that no matter where they are in the country, their answers will probably include some of the same things. Abandoned or vacant lots, graffiti, trash on the streets, places where it's dark at night. In fact, the physical signs of high-crime neighborhoods are so distinctive that one team of researchers was able to train a computer to recognize them with 95% accuracy. Tragically, however, the experiment backfired, and the computer is now leading a street gang. Here's the important thing to keep in mind. All those little details that signal to you that a place is unsafe also signal to criminals that it's not a bad place to do business. So what would happen if we just stopped sending those signals? For an idea of how this might work, we can look to an experiment that took place in Philadelphia. Many of the city's vacant lots, dirty and overgrown, had become magnets for crime because they were easy places to avoid detection, hide from police, or surprise a victim. Then, beginning in 2013, a team of researchers began randomly selecting some of these lots for rehabilitation. They'd clean them up, plant grass and trees, and turn them into small urban parks. Importantly, they'd also do things like keeping the lawn mowed as a signal that someone was maintaining the property. The result, crime around those lots went down. In the toughest neighborhoods, there was a 30% reduction in nuisance crimes like public intoxication or illegal dumping, and a 29% reduction in gun assaults. And here's the most important part. The crime didn't move to a different part of the city. It just went away. And this isn't the only time that changing the environment changed the outcomes. In the early 90s, Los Angeles closed off 14 streets plagued by gang violence and saw a 20% reduction in crime in the area within a year. A study in Newark found that the use of closed-circuit cameras decreased auto theft by nearly 15%, at a time when thefts were actually increasing on lots without the cameras. So, with those kinds of results, why don't we see these kinds of initiatives more often? Well, part of the reason is that they're not cheap. Cleaning up the rest of the dangerous lots in Philadelphia, for example, has been estimated to cost at least $35 million, which, yeah, sounds like a lot. But you know what else is expensive? Crime. In fact, it's estimated that when you add up the cost to the victims, to law enforcement, and to society at large, that every dollar spent cleaning up these dangerous places saves $26 by reducing gun violence. Now, not every one of these experiments is going to work for every problem. The cameras in Newark, for instance, reduced auto theft, but not violent crime. And even when they do work, you still need good policing on top of it. But one of the reasons that rehabilitating public spaces has so much potential is that the number of places that are consistently plagued by crime is surprisingly small. In Philadelphia, for instance, an analysis of over a decade's worth of crime data showed that just 5% of the addresses where crime was reported were responsible for 50% of all the crime in the entire city. Which means targeting just a handful of the most dangerous places could give some cities a new lease on life. The bottom line, we can potentially save lives and money just by rehabilitating a handful of the most dangerous places in our cities, which ought to be a source of hope, because it might just mean that no place is beyond saving. I mean, except IKEA.
Accepting what you're saying in relation to these concentrated on areas that had serious crime and or nuisance crime, is there anything that you see that knocks on to areas with less serious crime, or is there a definite, I suppose, tipping point in relation to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say we don't really have compelling evidence of like a tipping point. I mean, what I would like to see is, what happens if you try different dosages in different kind of communities with different levels of crime? Because I think then that would try to answer the question, like, where do you want to do it? The problem we have in cities like Philadelphia is there's such blighted spaces and such chronic violence that we're not really in the environment to to kind of try that yet. But that is definitely an area I think we're a lot more and also you could imagine doing a lot lower cost interventions, like just picking up the trash. In fact, the next experiment I'm going to launch is called it's going to be called Clean Streets, and that's what we're going to do. We're just going to have the streets cleaned up in some key areas. Like, that's something you could do anywhere.
When it talks about crime just going away, maybe it's because I'm quite simple in my outlook, and that would be wonderful if we were to do something similar, certainly in the UK, but it's got to go somewhere, so where is it going is my question.
Yeah, and obviously that's, this is a marketing company, so they give you more of it doesn't all just go away. You're going to have some displacement of crime. We don't find evidence of it being displaced right nearby, but certainly you're not going to get zero displacement. Some crimes are going to migrate other places. So like the gun violence, a lot of that goes down because you change the situational dynamics of that street corner. People don't hide their guns in those vacant lots or the houses. It's not like the violence, drug dealing and the violence associated with that just disappears, right? Some of it's going to move, but it's not going to, but those hot spots are endemic. They're not easily replaced. So I think, part of this it's a long-term strategy you have to go through. It's not exactly whack-a-mole, the game, though, where, pop, and then it pops up somewhere else. It might take another couple of years before you have another endemic hotspot. So part of this, an effort has to be kind of strategically, consistently do these kinds of interventions.
I'm really happy to see that this is one of the progress that can be implemented more places than in USA and UK, obviously. What I'm thinking about is the cost. Is there any plan to use the public as one of the stakeholders, people living in these areas and people working in the areas?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are efforts in cities like Philadelphia. They'll have a neighborhood cleanup and try to rely on volunteers. It's harder to do that regularly and sustain it, but there's a program now that the Horticultural Society has started where it's same-day pay, and you basically pay people to show up and do a cleanup for that day, and they get the money at that day. And we're actually going to try to scale that up in an experiment and see if that can work, because then the money's, it's being spent in the community, and for people that are, are interested in the money now, if you will, right? It's something you can get them to do, I think. So I think that's a possibility. It's hard to rely on volunteerism, but maybe not in Sweden. But in the U.S., we don't have a great history of sustaining something like that. Although there's community groups and churches and so forth that will do cleanup efforts, but getting it to be on kind of a bi-weekly basis, I think you have to have some public and private investment.